Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk a little bit about the difference between plot and story and subjective narration. And I know this is a topic I've talked about before, but I think this is a good illustration. I'm going to talk about two different things. One is the film Memento, and the other is Martin Amis's book at Time's Arrow. And the reason I want to talk about these is I think these investigate and use plot and story and subjective narration, limited narration, unreliable narration to great effect. And they show what can be done with it and show it in a way that helps us understand these concepts and why understanding the concepts actually helps us in the understanding of any narrative, and to show the ability of narrative to be shaped and changed depending on how authors and writers use these things. So what I mean by this is plot is the sequence of events as they are narrated to us. So when we watch Memento, if we think of all of the events of the film Memento, and we organize them from the earliest date in which the events occurred to the latest date in which the events occurred, that is taking all of the events of Memento and reorganizing them, because Memento is told in reverse chronological order. So the plot of Memento basically starts with the end, and it ends with the start. That's the plot. It's reversed. The story of Memento is when you take all of those events and you reorganize them chronologically. You start with the start and you end with the end. And on the DVD version of Memento, there was an option, a hidden option, to resequence the entire film chronologically. In effect, change plot to story. And what this did was it actually reduced the impact and interest that you had in the story, in the plot, in the narrative that was being created. One of the things about Memento that made it so enthralling as a film is that the central character, because of the memory condition, was constantly using, at the start of the scene, trying to reframe all of the contextual information to get a sense of what was going on. And there's a great sequence where the scene starts and he's running with a gun and someone else is running with a gun, and he's thinking in his head, am I chasing him or is he chasing me? Because the scene just starts with that, because that's where his memory, his perception of the scene starts. And this goes a lot to how unreliable narration actually can shape and change our interpretation of events. Because if the central character is pursuing someone, that is a very different narrative to if the central character is being pursued. And because Memento constantly resets this perception of the narrative, every sequence, every scene, we see sort of the end of things, and then we skip back a bit and we see how we got to that section, then it skips back again and how we got to that section. But it is not contiguous. It's not continuous. There isn't a through line, because the causal links between things are constantly broken. And each time the sequencing resets because the central character has forgotten how he got there, it's as if the entire narrative is starting anew. And because when he looks around, he sees the people around him, that he looks at the situation, he tries to analyze it and goes, this is what is happening. And the film constantly plays with that resetting. And we see how when we make assumptions about the narrative perspective or from the narrative perspective, we make assumptions about what is true, what is real. We see that so much of that is actually dependent on the perspective with which we are viewing the events. So I've talked about this in terms of character perspective. I've talked about it in terms of unreliable narration. But with Memento, Nolan really plays into how we can actually use that. So when we take the sequence when the central character is in the bar and he's talking to Carrie-Anne Moss's character, the bartender, if you resequence it chronologically, you see that the sequence that we get at the end, he's entirely wrong about what happens. But because we saw that sequence first, because the film is shown in a reverse chronology, we see that as the natural starting point and then the earlier development as the thing that is wrong. So it reverses and plays with perception of truth. It plays with perception of reality. And it is an absolutely fascinating example of how subjective narration can be used to create truth. The other thing that's very important about it is this idea of story and plot, because the story is the sequencing of events, as I said, from the earliest point to the latest point. So you take all of the different scenes and you use the secret feature on the DVD and you can resequence it all from earliest to latest. You see the sequence develop as he moves through it. And when you do that, it actually becomes quite a pedestrian film, that it is not a particularly engaging or enthralling film. The hook, what makes it interesting, is that constant resetting, but seeing the effect before we see the cause. And doing that each and every time actually makes it far more engaging. So if we resequenced everything chronologically, plot and story become identical. But because Nolan chose to resequence it, plot and story are actually very distinct in the film Memento. And this shows us how, when we engage with the different narrative events, looking at things chronologically is only one way to consider them, that all the narrative events and the causal links are there. But writers, authors, creatives can resequence things. So the causal links are still there, but because of the order in which they are presented, a different effect is created in the viewer. And we become less aware of the causal links, even though if it's resequenced into story with the chronology intact, we can see the causal links, we can see the entire continuation in a through line. But that is not how narrative must function. It is one way that narrative can function. So assumptions about sequencing causal links and how you must present things in terms of rising action and falling action, these are all assumptions that are made based on ways that we describe in general how narrative functions. These are not hard and fast rules that must be applied to create narrative. And knowing how these different trends and functions work, and knowing how to break them and what effect breaking them has, that is where true creativity comes in. So we've heard, and I think people give this sort of advice all the time about Freytag's pyramid, and you must follow introduction, instigating event, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement, that you have this structure. This is what you must do. And no, you don't have to do that. That's only one approach, one structure. If you're writing a narrative, you must have everything in the narrative must lead into the next thing. And you go, no, that's if you're sequencing it chronologically. As long as everything in your narrative supports the narrative that you are telling, the narrative that you are creating, those are things. But if you don't have one thing leading into the next, you must be aware of what effect that will have on your reader, on your audience. So it's not about rigidly applying rules. It's about understanding that these are general trends that cause effects, and these effects are well known and well understood. That's why these are viewed as guidelines and rules and laws. That's what they do. But knowing what the effect is when you break them allows you to break them. You're not beholden to them. The writing police aren't going to come by and arrest you for doing things out of order. Analepsis or flashbacks are common. Flash forwards or prolepsis is less common. But then again, in a lot of fantasy narratives, we use prophecy. And people go, oh, I hate prophecy as a trope. But with Memento, we know exactly how the film ends because we know the end sequence. That's basically the very first thing that we see. And we work backwards in time. So knowing that ending doesn't ruin the film because the fascination is how we get there. When, if we think back to the TV show Columbo, we saw the murder at the beginning of the episode. The hook for that particular TV show was seeing how Columbo worked out what happened and wore down the suspect, usually into confessing. That was the hook. It wasn't a who done it. It was how is the detective going to work it out? And that was, groundbreaking for its time as a mainstream show that essentially upset the norm of how you tell a murder story. Because if you think of the very traditional rules of how to tell a murder mystery, it's someone has been murdered and the police or the detectives show up and they slowly try to work it all out and the reader is following along with them until there's the reveal at the end that, ta-da, this is how it was done. With Columbo, it was, yeah, you know how it was done. You saw how it was done. What you don't know is why it was done. And we watch the police officer slowly figure it all out, figure out what the motives are, put it all together, and then bring the villain to justice. So it broke the rules of how you told a whodunit. But the showrunners of Columbo knew exactly what they were doing. They knew when they were breaking those rules, what effect it would have, and that's why they did it that way. So to turn to Martin Amis's Time's Arrow, and one of the reasons I want to talk about this is it goes to the recent, relatively recent controversy over the banning of Maus, Art Spiegelman's award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel by a Tennessee school board. That Martin Amis's Time's Arrow is a way of approaching a very difficult subject matter, the Holocaust and aspects of the Holocaust. And books like Schindler's Ark are very important, telling it as a story that we follow naturally and chronologically, that we see the horrors of this, and we get to the end, and there's a poignancy to the number of people that Schindler was able to save, but also the tragedy that so many others weren't. That this is an incredibly difficult period of history to read about. It is very distressing. And there are only apparently so many different ways that we can do it. It always has to be treated sensitively because this is real history. This does have repercussions for people living today. That we have survivors, the children of survivors, the grandchildren of survivors, and now we have the great-grandchildren of survivors. That there's a generational impact. It didn't just end with the ending of World War II. The repercussions of the horrors of World War II reverberate even today and are generational. And so this isn't something that can be treated lightly. And that's why, like, Spiegelman's Maus is such an incredible piece of fiction and biography and memoir and art and literature and should be read. But Martin Amis's Time's Arrow is, again, it's another way of approaching it that gets us to reassess and rethink about aspects of the Holocaust and how we approach it, because it is told in, again, reverse chronology. The narrator of the story is perceiving time the way that we do, but everyone in the story is living time backwards. And it's as if the narrator is inside the head of one person. And this sounds kind of weird, but the book begins with a character being dead and coming back to life. And this character is now going to live their life in reverse. They go from their death to their birth. So they die in America, and then the book follows all the way through skips through various events in their life to how they were born. And the narrator is that person, but is a separate consciousness, is not controlling the action. The narrator is perceiving time the way that we do and telling us the story of it, and is living the perception as if that moment of death of the character is the moment of birth for the narrator. So they are unreliable. They are perceiving the world and trying to make sense of the world from the position of they have just woken up, what is going on, and they're trying to figure things out. And what is fascinating about this is we see the reversal of a lot of our preconceived notions about things. So because it is in reverse, because the world has time essentially running backwards, we see both plot and story are inverted and played with. But we see certain positions and roles within society in a completely different light. So for instance, doctors are seen as incredibly cruel, because if you think of the sequence of events, you are in an emergency room and doctors come in and they rip the cast off your arm. They rip all of the dressings off your wounds. They take out all of the cleaning medicines that have been put in your wounds. And then they get dirt and they get these dirty rags and they rub the dirty rags in the room in your wounds. They break your arm. Then they put you on a gurney. They push the gurney out into the hallway. Paramedics come, take you on the gurney into an ambulance, drive you to the scene of an accident and throw you out. That's the sequence of events of people in this world, because they're living in reverse chronology. So doctors are seen as incredibly cruel. And this serves as that contrast when we get to the early part of the character's life, so the latter half of the novel, and we realize that he was a Nazi doctor working in the concentration camps. And because of this reversal of time, he is seen as very good because he brings thousands of people back to life. And that contrast, that shocking contrast, because it is not saying that the earlier doctors are evil, it's the framing of it. So now when we see this frame, we know that essentially morality has been reversed. So it is a way of approaching the shocking horror of what happened in the concentration camps in a new way, in a way that we are not already numb to, that we don't feel, oh, this is just another retelling. This is a way to sort of break through our numbness and ennui and lack of care about something that still has generational impact. And this framing of it is shocking because of that, because it goes immediately against our visceral reaction and understanding of the horrors of what is happening. And if this had been told chronologically, if the plot of this narrative had been the same as its story, we would have seen the transition of a young boy becoming a Nazi doctor, doing all of these horrendous, horrible, murderous experiments, fleeing the war, escaping Allied justice, setting up a new life in America, and living comfortably for the rest of his life as a doctor in America until he dies. Whereas what we see here, because we get all of that first, that end of his life first, we get a new appreciation of that. we get a different perspective of this story. And that impact is so, so powerful. And I think it is an incredible book. Not only technically is it very interesting, but this framing is important. And I know in some of the reviews of it, people said, well, why bother? Oh, this was just him trying to show off. He was just doing this. But the use of the reversal of time reframes things. It pits plot against story. And that contradiction, that contrast, that placing one interpretation of events against a different interpretation of the same events and making the reader actively negotiate between them means that you are more actively reading to try and understand. You are more engaged in the text. So instead of it just passively floating by and you just drifting along with it, you have to actually engage with it. So when you get to those truly harrowing sections, you have to engage with it. And you can't accept what's on the page and just move on. You actively have to decode it. And that means understanding it. And so it's an incredibly important trick and literary technique that Amos has employed. Now, he's not the first person to have used this specific method of telling a story. Lots of authors play with time and perception of time in this way. But I think this is incredibly well done. I think it's a very important novel. And it deals with a very harrowing and difficult subject. And it deals with it in a way that makes us, particularly those who don't have a familial or cultural connection specifically to those events, it gives us another insight into at least trying to understand the horror of what happened. So that is what I wanted to talk about today. The use of plot, the use of story as two different things, and the use of unreliable narration as a way of getting the viewer or the reader to engage more actively in what is being narrated to them so that they have to decode, can inspire a greater engagement with the text, be it a film or a book. And it does so in a way that helps us actively understand more because we are trying to decode. We are more actively engaged and we are more likely to pay attention and we are more likely to actually understand and get something from the text rather than passively receiving the information. So it can be used to generate interest, it can be used to generate engagement, and it can be used to reframe incredibly difficult topics in a way to sort of soften the blow, that it's not being used as horror for horror's sake or shock for shock value, but to still get us to engage with those incredibly important topics in a way that sort of protects our psyche almost. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.